put it there. Is it connected?
One, two, 1, 2.
Ah, okay. All right.
It's just a slight amplification.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, yes. I can hear it. Hello. Hello. Nice to meet you. I don't want to talk too much because everybody can hear what I'm saying. Yes, there was slight hiccup, but I was saying to somebody, there was once, I can't remember which country, but I think it was Sweden. It was a big event. There were several speakers. It was a Saturday. We couldn't get in. There was no way. So luckily, but there were lots of people. It was 3 or 4 of us. And luckily, the weather was good. So we did it outdoors without any slides or anything. But there was like, I don't know, 300 people there. So this happened to me before. Yeah. The trouble is I can't remember exactly where it was. I guess I was so traumatized I forgot. And I can't remember who else was there, but I remember there were several people. It was very amusing. Huh? Yeah, it all worked. Yeah, the screen looks very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jesus. Can you hear me? Yes, I don't like this thing, but I think not too well. Okay, so then I'll keep it. And all right. Well, let me just first say that it's a tremendous pleasure to be here. And I hadn't been to Iceland. I've been to many countries, but I hadn't been to Iceland until last year, and I liked it so much that I'm back here again for the second time. What an amazing place it is. And every time I come here, I don't know if it's Jesus' influence or somebody, but the weather is always like today. And coming from England, that is really quite exceptional. Now, so today, this evening, I'm going to tell you about the universe. The title of my talk is slightly strange. Well, everybody should know what I mean by everything. By everything, I mean the universe. But the tricky part is, what do I mean by nothing? So I'm not going to tell you yet what I mean by nothing. That would come later on. I'm going to tell you what nothing is, and I'm even going to show you a picture of nothing. But that will come later. And it has to do with how our universe was made. This, by the way, is the new building for my institute in Durham. Now, so the subject that I'm going to be telling you about is cosmology. And cosmology is an old subject. It asks some of the most fundamental questions that humans have ever asked themselves. Questions such as, how did the universe begin? What is it made of? How did it get to be the way it is? And what does the future hold? Now, these are, of course, questions that are very old. They go back to the beginnings of human civilization. I would even say that human civilization began when our ancestors started asking these sort of questions. I'm a physicist, and I try to approach these questions from the point of view of physics. But, of course, it's not just physicists who ask these questions. There are of interest to many other disciplines, to philosophers, of course, to theologians, to artists, and I think to the public in general. But there's one special characteristic or a special method in physics where we try to address these questions in a very rigorous framework with a very well-defined methodology, which is based on the laws of physics. Now, so let me just remind you, because I don't know how many of you are physicists. Am I right that most of you are not physicists? Can you please put your hands up if you're physicists? Well, several of you are, so you will know what I mean by the laws of physics. But for the other half who are not physicists, the laws of physics are just general rules about natural phenomena. And for the most part, these rules are derived from laboratory experiments here on Earth, with the exception of general relativity that seems to have come out of Einstein's head. But apart from that, most of the laws of physics, the laws of gravitation, the laws that describe how gases behave, electricity, and so on, they are derived empirically, expressed in mathematical language, and then developed through the language of mathematics. Now, one of the most remarkable things about our universe is that these very same laws of physics that we discovered here on Earth in our laboratories seem to be valid not just on Earth, but everywhere in the universe, everywhere we look, and at all times, even in conditions that bear no resemblance to the conditions in which the laws were discovered, like at the Big Bang, for example, where the densities, temperatures were unimaginably different from Earth. Somehow, the laws of physics seem to apply as well there as they do here on Earth. And to me, that is the most profound mystery of the universe. Why are the laws of physics universal? Why do they apply everywhere, as far as we can tell? Now, so the building blocks of the universe are galaxies. These are collections of stars ranging from a few hundred stars all the way to big galaxies like this one, which have hundreds of billions of stars. Now, to get into the right mood, let me show you a movie of what we have in our universe around us. Now, for the movie to be seen clearly, it'd be good to switch off the lights, but this is in Icelandic. Oh, probably. Oh, okay, maybe it's easier. So this is a movie that, oh, by the way, I should say that the Milky Way is a galaxy like this one, and we live 2/3 of the way, here we're in Reykjavik, 2/3 of the way away from the center of our Milky Way galaxy. Now, so I'm going to show you this movie that was made by astronomers in Hawaii, and it's just a tour of what we see in our neighborhood, in the local universe. So what you're going to see here is real data. There's only one bit of, artistic freedom. Most of it, I will tell you when that comes. Whoops, let me get rid of the music. There. Oh no, I don't want the music.
Is familiar from Earth, mapped here in 3D space by the Department.
How do I get it? Hold on, let me start again. How do I get rid of the music here? Somehow, this fellow doesn't want to get rid of the music. It should be this, huh? But it's not working. Right. Okay. Apologies for that. It's a good friend of mine who gave the narration, but he's a very good scientist with a terrible guitar player. Oh no, we're gonna have to put up with this fellow. Oh well, there's nothing I can do because I don't seem to be able to switch off the sound.
The constellations familiar from Earth,
I'll just let you hear him.
3D space by the Hipparcos satellite, quickly become unrecognizable as we drift toward the Orion star cloud 1,000 light years away. In the Great Orion Nebula, massive luminous young stars light up the dust and gas for 10 light years around. In the Horsehead Nebula, a dense knot of dust is silhouetted against red glowing hydrogen gas.
Ah, gosh, poor. All right, okay. So sorry about that. Let's restart for the last time. Whoops, where are we here? I think it's also difficult to understand what he says. Anyway, so here we go again. So this is, as I said, a tour of our local universe. And as you were already beginning to glean from that intrusion by my colleague, we're heading here. This is the night sky, and we're heading to the constellation of Orion that many of you will recognize. And next to the constellation of Orion, there's a cloud of gas and dust called the Orion Nebula. And these are places where young stars are being born at a rate of about one new star in the Milky Way every 100 years. It's a very famous nebula called, for obvious reasons, the Horsehead Nebula. And here you also see these young stars being formed. In fact, stars, they say the Milky Way continues to make stars at a rate of 1 per 100 years, and they often born in groups, like in the Carina Nebula. That's the name of this gas cloud. And you can see there that there are many stars being born at once together. But in fact, not all of these gas clouds are nurseries of stars. Some, like the Crab Nebula, this one here, this is in fact the graveyard of a star that ran out of nuclear fuel, which is why stars shine. And when it died, it ejected its outer envelope and left behind something called a pulsar that maybe you can see pulsating over there. Now, this is the only bit of artistic license in this movie where we're going to leave our galaxy. Of course, we cannot get out of our own Milky Way galaxy. So this is a galaxy very similar to our own Milky Way. This is what the Milky Way would look like if we were able to see it from outside. And the Milky Way is accompanied by these smaller galaxies called dwarf galaxies, the Large Magellanic Cloud, the Small Magellanic Cloud. And now, I should say, the size of a galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. So here's our nearest neighbor called the Andromeda Galaxy, which has its own neighbor. And this one lies at 2 million light years away. So the light that you see from this galaxy with its own gas cloud has been traveling for 2 million years before it gets to us. Now we're going to eventually head towards a cluster of galaxies down here, but before we do that, we will take the opportunity to look at some of the incredible things that nature has made. Galaxies like these ones is called grand design spirals, beautiful objects that nature has managed to make. Somehow here's the famous galaxy M51 interacting with its neighbor. And you can see here that the distribution of galaxies is complex. And as I will tell you later, this distribution of galaxies tells us about the beginning of the universe. But we're going to head to a cluster of galaxies called the Virgo cluster, which is at about 10 million light years away. So the light here is taken 10 million years from the moment it was emitted to the moment we see it. And in the middle of the Virgo cluster, there's a very famous galaxy called M87. It's famous for a number of reasons, not least of which is that it has a gigantic black hole in the center that weighs 1 billion times as much as the sun, and it's eating everything around it. There's a little jet that maybe you saw, which is the result of this digestion. Now, so that will show you what the universe around us looks like. And what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is to tell you where we think all these structures came from. And you're in, if you haven't heard about this before, for a big surprise. Now, so of the questions I wrote down before, I don't have time to go through all of those. We're almost there, Jesus. I'm going to focus on, first of all, the second one here, what is the universe made of? Because that too is a big surprise. So you might be shocked that even though we spend lots and lots of billions of dollars or pounds or whatever, that until about 20 years ago, astronomers didn't know what the universe is made of. I think that's perfect now. Thank you, Jesus. So one of the big surprises of science of the last 20 years or so has been to make an inventory of what our universe contains. Now, and that, as I say, is a big surprise. So, of course, the universe contains ordinary matter. That's the matter that made of atoms, of which we and the Earth, the sun, the stars are made of. We call that ordinary matter, made of chemical elements from the periodic table. And that makes up, in fact, only 5% of what the universe contains. So only 5% is normal matter, most of which is, in fact, in the form of gas, of hydrogen and helium. About 25% is also matter, but it is not made of ordinary matter. It's dark, and hence the name dark matter, and it is matter that does not emit light at any wavelength. So this is one of the protagonists of this talk. I'm going to tell you a lot about dark matter, and it makes up 25% of what the universe contains. And the lion's share of the universe is not even matter. It's something called dark energy, which was only discovered at the end of the 20th century. And I will tell you a little bit more about dark energy, but not much, because we don't know much about it. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides about dark energy, and then by the time I've gone through these two slides, you will be more or less on the same level as the professional physicists who work in this subject. Now, so let me tell you about dark energy. That has to do with the expansion of the universe. So the fact that the universe is expanding was discovered by this man, Edwin Hubble, in the days when physicists or astronomers were allowed to smoke in their offices. You can't do that anymore. Now, so Edwin Hubble had an assistant who measured distances to galaxies around us and made a graph of the velocity of these galaxies against their distance. And what he found is that, sorry, I forgot the name of the assistant, Mark, who is the person who should get the credit. Anyway, he found that the galaxies are all moving away from us at velocity that increases proportionally with distance. So what Hubble measured or observed is all galaxies are moving away from us, and he had then discovered the expansion of the universe. Now, by the way, this used to be called Hubble's law, and earlier this year, the International Astronomical Union renamed it, and it's no longer Hubble's law. It's now the Hubble-Lemaitre law, because even the measurements as well as this graph was made at the same time, roughly, by a Belgian priest, in fact, called Georges Lemaitre. So it's now the Hubble-Lemaitre law. Anyway, so we've known then that the universe has been expanding for a long time, but in 1998, astronomers using or looking at very distant supernovae were able to map the rate at which the universe is expanding. And to their shock, and the shock of everybody else, they found that not only is the universe expanding, but the velocity at which it is expanding keeps increasing with time. So the expansion is accelerating in something, a discovery that was completely unexpected, because you would have expected that if the universe started with, as it did, with a Big Bang, and galaxies are moving away from each other, then eventually, due to the force of gravity, then the expansion should slow down. And in fact, what was discovered is the opposite, that the expansion of the universe is accelerating. Now, so because most of the universe is empty, then the conclusion is there must be something in empty space that is causing this accelerated expansion. And that something, whatever it is what we call dark energy. And although we don't know much about it, this discovery was enough to earn the Nobel Prize in Physics to 3 people whose pictures you can see in the physics department. They made the discovery. And even though we don't understand what's causing this accelerated expansion, it is sufficiently important to earn a Nobel Prize. Now, so what is the cosmic dark energy? Well, I already gave you a hint, but most of the universe is empty. So between the Milky Way and the Andromeda Galaxy, there's nothing. It's just emptiness. It's the nothing I'm going to come back to later. And whatever this nothing is, it is pushing away, not Andromeda, but galaxies further away from us. And so whatever the dark energy is, it probably has some form of repulsive force causing the expansion to accelerate, and it must have to do with empty space, with what we call the vacuum. And this is about it. This is about the current state of understanding of dark energy. It's just a fact. Our universe is behaving in a bizarre way, and we do not know really why it's doing this. So that's all I'm going to tell you about dark energy. If you want to know some more, but there's not a lot more to say, I'll be happy to talk about it later. But now I want to focus on the other part of the universe, which is still unknown, but about which we know indirectly a lot more, and that is the dark matter. So the dark matter is everywhere. It's in here, in this room. But in particular, it's what keeps galaxies like the Milky Way together. So the stars in the Milky Way, or this is not the Milky Way, but it's like the Milky Way, are rotating around the center, and they're going too fast to be kept in place by the gravitational force produced by the material that you can see. So you see stars and gas clouds, they produce gravity, but when astronomers measure the velocities of the stars, they find they're going too fast, and they should have flown out of the galaxy unless there was some additional mass that we cannot see that's keeping them in place. So that's the idea, and it goes back to this gentleman, Newton. And said the other day I was in London, and was thinking about this, and it was amazing. I ran into Newton. Here he is. I even took a picture with Newton. And so Newton's come back. It is Newton. I mean, you see the hair, of course, is the same. The nose is the same. The mouth is the same. And so Newton's come back to life. Do people here know who this fellow is? Yes. Well, the reason I know him is not because he's a famous musician. He's also an astronomer. He has a PhD in astronomy, and I've known him for many years. But he decided that music was more lucrative than astronomy, so he's now a professional musician, Brian May. And he explained to me what I just said, that the stars are rotating too fast to be held in place by the gravity of what we can see. So that is the first evidence we have for the existence of dark matter. But the way then to think about a galaxy is as a kind of pool of stars and light embedded in a clump of dark matter, which astronomers call dark matter halos. So a halo is what the way we use to refer to these clumps of dark matter in which galaxies sit. Now, so you might say, well, that's a bit indirect. Is that all? Is that all the evidence? Well, no. We have much more direct evidence, or as direct, through one of the most amazing phenomena that nature has produced, and which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. Now, this is a picture, very famous picture, taken by the Hubble Space Telescope of a galaxy cluster. I already told you about the Virgo cluster. This is not Virgo. This is another cluster, a long way away. But it is also like Virgo, a collection of a few hundred or thousand bright galaxies. Now, when you look at this picture, you can immediately see that there are normal-looking galaxies like the ones we saw before, but also there are all these bizarre art-like objects, like this one, that one, that one. What are these? Well, these are actually also galaxies, but they don't belong to the cluster. These galaxies are way behind the cluster, a long, long way behind. And what's happened to these poor galaxies is that their light has been propagating, and when it comes near the cluster, the light has been deflected by the gravity of the mass associated with the cluster. So gravity can deflect light, and that, in fact, is one of the great discoveries of this man who, in the way in which science used to be done at the turn of the 20th century, sent a letter to his colleagues telling them, oh, I found something quite interesting. If you have a source of light passing near a massive body, then because of E equals mc squared, m, which is the mass of the object, can affect E, which is the energy of light, and can cause light to be deflected. And so what we see here are images of galaxies whose light has been deflected by the gravity of the cluster, and if light is deflected, then the image is distorted. If you put a spoon in a glass of water, then you see sometimes that the spoon is bent. The spoon is not bent, it's just the image, and that happens because the light that's reflecting from the spoon is bent by going through the water, and that distorts the image of the spoon. It's exactly analogous to what's happening here, but this phenomenon, which I'm about to demonstrate to you, is very important because it allows us to tell how much matter the cluster has. And it turns out that the result is that there must be about 10 times as much dark matter that we don't see than compared to visible mass in order to produce these so-called gravitational lensed arcs. So I'm going to demonstrate that to you. So here's a picture, by the way. This is an interesting picture. This is the deepest image that humans have ever made, with the Hubble Space Telescope as well. And the galaxies you see here are a long, 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 long way away. That light has taken not millions, but billions of years to get to us. So it's just an image, and the experiment we're going to do is that we're going to, in the middle, imagine a lump of dark matter, and the lump is going to get more and more massive, and then you see what it does to the images of these tapestry of background galaxies. So this was done by a colleague of mine at my university, where all he's done is solve Einstein's equation and trace the light rays from these galaxies as they go by this lump of dark matter, whose mass is going to grow gradually so that you can appreciate the effects of gravitational lensing. So here's the lump beginning to grow, and you see how it's distorting this tapestry of background galaxies, producing similar features to the ones that the Hubble Space Telescope saw. So we understand relativity, we understand deflection of light, gravitational lensing, and as I just said, we can use that to figure out how much dark matter the cluster has, and the answer is that it has about 10 times as much as there is in visible matter. So that's the evidence for dark matter. And now the question now is what is the dark matter? Now, the current view of what the dark matter is, but we don't know for sure because the dark matter hasn't been discovered yet directly, only indirectly. But the current view is that the dark matter is some form of elementary particle that was produced very soon after the Big Bang. Here's a picture of the Big Bang. I'm going to come back to that later. Here's the Big Bang. Here we are today, 13.7 billion years later. And the dark matter is thought to be some small particle produced when the universe was very young. And the most popular candidate for dark matter is something called cold dark matter. It's just some particular type of elementary particle. So that is the key assumption of modern cosmology, that the dark matter is made of particles that are different from the particles that we're made of. We're made of protons, neutrons, mostly electrons and other things. These are not that. These are other kinds of particles formed in the early universe and which do not make atoms and are, in fact, completely dark. So I think if you ask the ordinary physicist in the street, what is the dark matter? They'll tell you, we don't quite know what particle, but it's almost certainly a particle. So that's fine, but I was amazed that even politicians know what the dark matter is. I guess everybody knows who this lady, but this is an old picture. She's gone through many things since this picture was taken, so she doesn't look like that. And somebody asked Angela Merkel, what is dark matter? So it's an elementary particle. It's a tiny little particle, and but not surprising because she's actually a physicist. I don't know if people knew that. It's maybe the wrong kind of physicist, but she is a physicist. So that is not a big surprise, but we have our own prime minister for at least for the next few days, Theresa May, and when she was asked the same question, well, she didn't really know what she was, but she made the mistake of having Angela Merkel next to her, who told her, well, don't be stupid, and at least she understood that. She doesn't understand anything about Brexit. She doesn't understand anything about politics. At least she got the idea that the dark matter is a particle. Now, however, they're not all as bright as that. Look at this guy. Now, he had a great master who explained to him the dark matter is a particle, but unlike Theresa May, he didn't even get it. So here we are with this man not having a clue about dark matter or about anything else as far as I can tell. Now, here in Iceland, you still have a little bit of work to do because she really hasn't got it yet. But she will, I'm sure, eventually. So, even politicians think they know what the dark matter is, but it's no good politicians knowing, because that's not the way we do science. We don't, unlike politicians who want to tell you the truth, we don't tell you the truth. We go look for the truth. So the search for dark matter is part of experimental physics. And I don't know if you've ever seen an experimental particle physicist, but this is what they look like. And they go around looking for dark matter. But the dark matter is not easy to find. It's dark. What that means is that it doesn't interact with other matter, or if it interacts very weakly. So this room, if the dark matter is called dark matter, which is what I think it probably is, or something like it, this room is full of dark matter. There are billions of dark matter particles going through us as we speak, every second. You have billions of these particles going through your body, but it doesn't do you any harm because they don't interact. They just go straight through the door, and they go through the earth, and you never feel them. So that's good for our health, but it's very bad if you want to detect it, because if you build a detector, then the particle just goes through the detector and leaves no signal most of the time. Eventually, if you get very lucky, a dark matter particle from the halo of the Milky Way will hit an atom in a detector, and you might find evidence for it. And there are many people around the world are looking for dark matter. These experiments are usually done in mines, deep mines, in order to filter out lots of debris that rains on the Earth, and in order, because the signal that we're looking for here is very, very weak. So that's a mine in Canada. There's one, in fact, near where I live in England, in a place called Bolby in North Yorkshire, and where, again, there is an experiment here at the bottom of the mine. I like this one because, well, it's close to where I am. I've been down the mine many times, but also it's near a place in North Yorkshire called Whitby. Now, Whitby is very famous because that's where Dracula landed when it came to England, or he came to England, and so there's no better place to be looking for dark matter than next to where Dracula is meant to have landed in the country. Now, suffice it to say that these experiments have not succeeded yet. If they had, you would know about it, but they've been running for a long time, and we hope that one of these days you'll wake up in the morning and read in the newspaper somebody has a signal of a dark matter particle hitting a detector. So now I want to ask the question, well, why is the dark matter so important? And the answer is, without it, we wouldn't be here, because the dark matter is most of the mass. Therefore, it exerts most of the gravitational force in the universe, and the whole edifice of the universe has been sculpted by gravity, and gravity is due to dark matter. So if there was no dark matter, there would be no galaxies, no stars, no planets, not even the beautiful island of Iceland. So let me tell you now about how the universe became to be the way it is. So what I'm going to ask, so the answer is what I just told you, that the gravity of the dark matter drives the formation of cosmic structure. So let me now tell you a little bit about current views on how galaxies formed. So we go back to the Big Bang, and this is an amazing story because the beginning of the story goes back almost to the beginning of our universe. In fact, not quite the beginning, but almost, to a time equal to a decimal point, 34 zeros, and a 1, to that fraction of a second, to 10 to the minus 35 seconds after the Big Bang. That's when the story begins. This is the earliest time at which physicists can make statements about the universe and keep a straight face. That's how far we can go with the known laws of physics. Now, and here we come to the second part of my title. I'm about to tell you what I mean by nothing. So, I mean something very specific by nothing. And let us imagine an experiment that physicists have done many, many times. This is done routinely in laboratories every day. You have a chamber, and you have a pump that is very, very powerful pump. So imagine that you get this pump to extract all the contents of the chamber. So you take out everything inside this chamber until there's not a single molecule left, not a single atom left, not a single electron left. You think that is a vacuum, and that is, in fact, what all physicists mean by the vacuum. So you have this chamber, you've taken everything out of it, which is not possible, by the way, but in theory you could do it. And then you go and have a look with a very fine instrument that allows you to see in very, very fine detail. So this is what you would see. You think you've taken everything out? Wrong. There's still something left, no matter how hard you try. Now, these particles that you see here are not real as such. Even they're called virtual particles. And what they are a form of energy that lies at the root of quantum physics and lies at the root of the most fundamental structure of the universe. So these are actually virtual particles of matter and antimatter which come out of this energy called the vacuum energy. They don't live for very long. They hardly live at all. They come out spontaneously from the vacuum energy. They collide, matter and antimatter. They annihilate into energy, which keeps decaying into matter and antimatter, and itself annihilating into energy. Now, if it's the first time you hear this, you're going to think, well, this fellow was already quite crazy. He's completely crazy. Not. This is the basis of quantum physics. It's related to something called the uncertainty principle. And all you need to understand is that there's uncertainty about everything in quantum physics. And in particular, this uncertainty manifests itself in the creation and annihilation of these virtual particles. But the main point is that this acts as a form of energy. And what we mean by vacuum in physics and what I mean by nothing is this energy of the vacuum. It doesn't matter if you didn't quite understand what I just told you. That was the hardest part of this lecture, by the way. All you need to understand is that even the vacuum has some form of energy that we can't get rid of. And that vacuum energy has played a key role in the evolution of our universe. Because according to current ideas, when our universe began, it had too much of this vacuum energy, and the universe reacted to that by expanding very quickly in a process known as cosmic inflation, in which the universe grew very quickly for a very short period of time until it got rid of this vacuum energy, or at least most of it. Now, but the key point is that this vacuum fluctuations, these are called quantum fluctuations of the vacuum that I just showed you, that accompanied the existence of this vacuum energy, when the universe stretched a lot by expanding very fast, these particles, or these fluctuations, called quantum fluctuations, created small ripples in the energy of the universe. And those ripples, which I show here macroscopically, they, according to current theories, and I'm going to show you where it comes from, are the progenitors of everything we have in the universe. So, according to current views, which I will explain in more detail in a minute, all galaxies, all stars, all planets, including us, well, not planets, people as well, we all go back to quantum fluctuations of the vacuum. Now, if you think that sounds pretty crazy, it does. Crazier still, I'm going to show you evidence. I'm going to show you real empirical evidence for this in a minute. But the next important event here, as I've already mentioned, is the production of dark matter, which happens a lot later, still a tiny fraction of a second after the Big Bang, not 10 to the minus 35, 10 to the minus 10 seconds. And this dark matter will cause these small fluctuations to amplify. And that is how eventually galaxies will form. So, the proposition then of modern cosmology is that tiny quantum irregularities were hugely amplified by the gravity of the dark matter, giving rise to the universe in which we live. Now, every time I say that, I imagine what would happen if Einstein or Newton walked through the door and heard this fairly respectable physicist saying this craziness. Galaxies come out of quantum fluctuations, especially Einstein. Einstein was never convinced by quantum physics, even though he discovered quantum physics in a way. What would Einstein say if, or Newton, who thought the universe was eternal, for good reasons, by the way, walked through the door and heard these ideas? Well, I know exactly what Einstein would do. That is what Einstein would do. And I know what Newton would do. Newton would say, what? I'll become a musician instead. So these ideas are pretty extravagant. But I told you from the beginning, we're talking about physics. And in physics, you're allowed to make extravagant propositions. You still get paid at the end of the month, so long as your crazy ideas are testable empirically by experiment. In fact, I'm about to tell you in the remaining minutes I have that these ideas are testable. So how on earth do we test these ideas that refer to phenomena that happened when the universe was a tiny fraction of its age today? Well, we're held by nature. The early universe was very hot. And in fact, very early on, the universe was foggy. Because at these early times, tiny fraction of a second after the Big Bang, atoms hadn't yet formed. So the universe was a soup of elementary particles, including electrons and radiation, which scattered off the electrons, producing a fog. However, 350,000 years after the Big Bang, the universe had cooled enough that the first atoms, which were hydrogen atoms, formed, and the electrons that were scattering the light, producing the fog, fell into atoms, and there was nothing to scatter the light, and the universe emitted the light from the Big Bang. That was the first light in the universe, happened 350,000 years after the Big Bang. Now, that light, so we'll tell you in a minute, is everywhere and allows us to peer into the universe at early times. So this light, radiation from the Big Bang, has been propagating since the Big Bang, which happened a long time ago, so long that this radiation has now cooled. And today, it has a temperature of only 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. And at that cold temperature, this light, appears in the form of radio waves, in fact, in the form of microwaves, which is a form of radio waves. Now that radiation, called the cosmic microwave background radiation, was discovered in 1964 by these two gentlemen, Arno Penzias and Bob Wilson, accidentally, like many of the great discoveries in science, like penicillin. This was a complete accident. They didn't even know that this radiation existed. They were, in fact, radio specialists who had worked during the war on radar and now became later radio astronomers. They built this very, very famous radio telescope. This is a radio telescope of the 60s. And they were just trying to detect radio waves from the sun. But they were very annoyed that even when they pointed the telescope away from the sun, they still had a signal. In fact, the story is that at one point, they thought they identified the signal, they climbed inside the telescope, and they found that some pigeons had nested there, and it was full of pigeon droppings. And I thought that must be the signal. And then they cleaned it, and it was still there. In fact, this is one of the most dramatic stories in science. Do I have time to tell you a story? Okay, so I'll very quickly tell you this story. It's one of my favorite stories. These people worked in Bell Labs in New Jersey, and just 20 miles away from Bell Labs was Princeton University, where 3 of the greatest physicists of last century were there, and 2 young ones, Wilkinson, Bob Wilkinson, and Jim Peebles, and an older, the supervisor, Robert Dickey. Now, Peebles was just a PhD student. I know there are some PhD students here. Don't get a complex when you hear that as a student, Peebles had already realized that this microwave background had to be there. In fact, he wasn't the first. A Russian who was a refugee in the US, called Gamov, have already concluded the same thing. But Peebles did it, found the same thing in a different way. So Peebles realized this radiation had to be there. Bob Dickey, his supervisor, as an experimental physicist, said, let's go look for it. And they discovered that these 2 gentlemen had the signal accidentally in a flight between New York and Washington, where coincidentally Bob Dickey happened to be sitting next to the boss of Bell Labs, who told him, we got this very strange, annoying signal. And apparently Dickey's airplane landed in Washington. He took the first flight back, called Peebles and Wilkinson to his office and said, boys, we've been scooped. And in fact, the people who got the Nobel Prize were those 2. And there were 2 papers that appear back to back. One saying, we found this thing, and the other paper saying, this is what it is. You discovered the Big Bang. You discovered the radiation from the Big Bang. Now, so then that is crucial, because in the early universe, these fluctuations grow, amplified by the gravity of the dark matter, and by the time this radiation is emitted, then these fluctuations have grown. They're still very small, but much bigger than they were initially, and they perturb the energy of the universe, including the temperature of this radiation from the Big Bang. And in the 1980s, Peebles actually, and others, calculated what the temperature of the sky, of the temperature of this radiation on the sky should look like as a result of these fluctuations introduced by these quantum fluctuations of the vacuum. So Jim discovered, or calculated what these, and others, what these fluctuations should look like. 1992 was in fact, April 22nd, 1992, was a landmark year in the history of science, because NASA's COBE satellite published this picture. So let me tell you what this picture is. So this is a picture of the temperature of this cosmic radiation, microwave background radiation. Of course, the radiation comes from everywhere in the sky, but if you want to project it onto a screen, you have to flatten through a mathematical transformation the sphere, and what you see here is a version of the sphere, celestial sphere around us. And what you see here is a map of the temperature of this radiation. And what you see is not uniform. It has cold spots and hot spots. And this discovery made headline news around the universe, around the Earth. Here, I hope you forgive me. I'm going to leave my usual modesty to one side. I play the role in this, which you can see reported here on the front cover of the Independent newspaper. It says here, Carlos Frenk, an astronomer at Durham, said yesterday, "Oh, wow." And that's my great contribution to cosmology, my great contribution to human civilization. It was a wow moment. I mean, to be fair, I had a phone call. This is NASA. NASA very good at PR. So my phone rang at 6 in the morning. I was in bed, of course. And I have this American voice telling me, "Hey, Dr. Frank, what do you think about the discovery of temperature fluctuation in microwave?" So what do you say at 6 in the morning? Oh, wow. But it really was a wow moment. And my wife knows that when I die, my epitaph will say, "Oh, wow." Now, so that, because it really, I think, in my whole scientific career, this has been as exciting as it gets. Now, that radiation was remeasured a decade later by another, this won George Smoot, the Nobel Prize in Physics, in 2006. The radiation was remeasured a decade later by a telescope called WMAP. The W stands for Wilkinson, one of the three in Princeton who designed this instrument. And sadly died of cancer just before it produced this image. So it was posthumously renamed the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe. And then 10 years later, the Europeans caught up and published what is now the definitive measure of the temperature of the microwave background radiation with much, much better resolution than the original COBE discovery. Now, here's the only technical plot I have. The details don't matter. This is a paper, comes from a paper by Jim Peebles. And what it shows is, in quantitative mathematical language, the properties of this radiation. So for the physicists here, this is just the power spectrum. It just shows you the temperature difference, the typical temperature difference between 2 points in the sky as you look at points further and further away. So the technical details don't matter. All I want to point out is that these predictions can be made using the laws of physics, and they're not trivial. This so-called power spectrum has peaks and valleys. It's complicated, although the physics are relatively simple and well understood. So these were the theoretical predictions in the 1980s. And now let me show you how they compare to the data from Planck. So here are Peebles' predictions from 1982 in green, and in red are the measurements of the quantity that Peebles predicted from the Planck data. Now, every time I see this picture, which I've seen hundreds of times, I've talked about it hundreds of times, but I can't just see it and carry on, because I think, and I'm sure you will agree, that this is one of the greatest, I think, achievements of physicists, for sure, cosmologists, but I would say probably of humans, because what you see here are two things. Firstly, you see the theoretical line. Now, this theory is a theory that tells us about phenomena that occurred when our universe was being born. It's to do with these quantum fluctuations. Now, why is it that in this little planet in the outskirts of a galaxy, like there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, why is it that in this little place a species of living creature evolved capable of making predictions about how the whole universe began? That is a wonder. But equally amazing is the fact that members of the species are also capable of building machines that they launch out of the planet that can make measurements of exquisite accuracy, because even though I told you the temperature fluctuations are relatively large, the signals here are tiny. They're 1 part in 100,000. So these machines measure deviations in temperature of 1 part in 100,000. So that, to me, is absolutely remarkable. And I say it's in science, I think it's the equivalent of a Beethoven symphony or a Rembrandt painting, or perhaps even more than that, because a Beethoven symphony is the result of the genius of one man. A Rembrandt painting is the same story. This is the result of the work of directly of thousands of scientists and indirectly of the whole of the edifice of physics, because the ideas here rely on everything we know about physics. All right, well, enough of poetry, and let me now, in the last few minutes, tell you how we actually know that. But this, by the way, I promise you evidence that these crazy ideas had some validity to them. This is it. This is the evidence, because I should have stressed the green curve assumes quantum fluctuations from inflation, assumes cold dark matter. And so this is the empirical experimental evidence I offered to show you about these crazy ideas about the early universe. And now all I want to do is show you how these tiny fluctuations that we see here reflected in the light from the Big Bang turn into galaxies. Now, that is a topic that of great interest, including here in Reykjavik. There is a group of people led by Jesus over there, and I see some of his colleagues, my former student Mark Lobel, and Jesus' students and postdocs here. They work largely on this general topic of trying to understand how, or different aspects of how, from these initial conditions, we ended up making a universe with galaxies. And now it becomes a relatively straightforward problem. We just need to calculate. We know the laws of physics. In particular, we know how gravity behaves. We know a few other things. And we have the initial conditions. And what we now want to do is see, under the laws of physics, how these initial conditions evolve. Do they make galaxies or not? The best way to do that is using a big computer. And so how do you make a universe in a computer? Well, if you know the starting point, quantum fluctuations of the vacuum, and you make an assumption about the nature of the dark matter, cold dark matter, or other, they work on different types of dark matter. We don't yet know what it is, but you assume something about the dark matter. You know the initial conditions. All you need to do is solve the equations of physics, relativity, mechanics, and other more complicated equations that we know how to solve. Program a computer to do solve them, and hope your computer doesn't crash. And oh gosh, I don't believe this. Apple, right? Okay, and program the computer, let it calculate, and then come back and see, if you're lucky, that what came out is something like that. So let me show you, to finish off, almost just 3 movies. The first one is a picture of how these quantum fluctuations, this is a calculation from a big supercomputer, how these quantum fluctuations produced a dark matter halo, like the halo of the Milky Way. Now, so this is just dark matter. You see a batch of the universe at early times. It's not uniform. It's been perturbed by these quantum fluctuations of the vacuum. And then gravity takes over, amplifies these fluctuations. So where there was an excess of matter, like here, then because of gravity, more matter piles up, because gravity attracts, and lumps begin to form. The lumps attract one another. And when these lumps, as you can see here, collide, they coalesce. They go through phases that we won an art prize, actually, with this movie. They go through phases that are just aesthetically amazing. This is something called, a version of something called the cosmic web. All that is happening here is gravity amplifying these quantum fluctuations, and structure grows. simply, as I said, by big lumps attracting other lumps. Here you see a particularly dramatic example of how these lumps coalesce. They're attracted by this bigger lump. They're going to fall together just under the action of gravity in an expanding universe. And little by little, in what we call a hierarchical way, from small to big, then the halo of the Milky Way emerges out of these quantum fluctuations of the vacuum, and eventually the Milky Way will form in a way I will show you in another movie in a second, as gas cools in and turns into stars inside this dark matter halo. Let's quickly do a tour of what the universe would look like if we could see the dark matter. This comes from a simulation called the Millennium simulation done in Germany. And here is what you could see if you were able to see the dark matter and fly very, very quickly, much faster than the speed of light through the universe. You would see this amazing tapestry of structure with big filaments that intersect. This is where the galaxy clusters form, and zillions and zillions of little dark matter halos where smaller galaxies form. So that's what you would see if you were able to detect the dark matter. And now, so in the last 5 years or so, there's been a big breakthrough in being able to model not just the evolution of dark matter, like I show you in these movies, but also the evolution of the ordinary matter, which of course, even though it's small in absolute terms, in terms of its contribution to the mass budget of the universe, it's what we're made of. And we, of course, want to know in more detail how galaxies form. So here's a movie from a calculation done at my institute just a few years ago. And what we're going to see here again, these are the quantum fluctuations. You see here, at first, just the dark matter, but we're soon going to switch to see the evolution of ordinary matter, of gas, something called the EAGLE simulations. Now, here's what the gas is doing. The gas is following the dark matter, and we're going to zoom into a early version of a galaxy. You see these gas clouds. What we're seeing here is just gas clouds. They're following the gravity of the dark matter. So where you saw these lumps of dark matter coalescing, the gas inside them also does that. But gas is spinning, and then it settles, unlike the dark matter, that settles into a lump. The stars that you see here, the gas and then the stars, settle into disks, like the disks of the galaxies that we see. So you see here the emergence of a galaxy from a computer, from a virtual universe, and all the computer is doing is applying the laws of physics to these crazy ideas about the beginning of our universe. So we're nearly done. We're only a few, less than 1 billion years from the present. And here we cut again to the stars. And now we're going to pan out of our zoom because this, of course, is not just happening to one galaxy. It's happening everywhere in the universe. Now here is a picture of some galaxies. Now, there are astronomers here. These didn't come from the Hubble Atlas. These are galaxies that came out of a computer. So I'm nearly done. What these simulations do is they take the quantum fluctuations of the vacuum, we program those into a computer, and we end up producing things like that. So let me conclude then. So what I've been telling you tonight, well, a story that began very soon after the Big Bang. When the universe inflated, it went through a period of exponential expansion driven by the energy of the vacuum. This energy of the vacuum had quantum fluctuations which produced perturbations or ripples in the energy of the Big Bang that were inherited by the radiation from the Big Bang and observed as temperature fluctuations in the microwave background radiation. We know the initial conditions for the formation of structure in the universe. We program those in a computer, and we can make virtual universes like the one you saw. So that's the end of the story. But you might wonder, well, is there anything left for these guys here? So there are young studying their PhDs in some cases, a bit more advanced in other cases. Have my generation left anything for you to do? Well, the answer is yes. But it gets harder, I can just tell you. But when I started, it was really hard. It now looks easy. So what looks hard to you one day might look easy to your successors. But what are the open questions? Well, I like to illustrate the 3 big open questions in the subject with one of my favorite paintings. This is Hieronymus Bosch, Garden of Early Delight. It's a triptych. Here on the right is the Earth. You can see with all its good and bad. Sorry, this is not the Earth, sorry. This is the Earth, this is hell. So here's the Earth. Here on the Earth, I think an earthly question is, what is the dark matter? It remains an open question. I put it here on the Earth because I think it's one that we can solve. I think we will find out what dark matter is sooner or later. This is hell. And in hell, I put a much harder question, a hellish question, which is, what is the dark energy? I don't think my generation will solve this problem. Maybe their generation will, but it's a hellish problem. But here, for paradise, I reserved perhaps the biggest question of them all, which is, how did it all begin? So today we know the universe began with a Big Bang, but we have no idea of what exactly went bang, or what was there before the universe. Now these are questions that preoccupy societies enough that where politicians, in spite of all the stupidities they commit day by day, are willing to invest billions of dollars or pounds or kroner. And there are a number of instruments that are being planned that will try to tackle this question. What is the dark matter? What is the dark energy? How did everything begin? And of course, in addition, so I changed my password and I've forgotten, so this thing keeps torturing me with if I can't even get rid of that one. Anyway, and we also have, of course, the human mind, the human creativity and ingenuity aided and expanded as it is today by the amazing technology of computers. So let me just leave you with a picture almost from my office in Durham, by telling you that, as I hope you've learned tonight, there's been enormous progress in the subject over the past 30 years, but actually, I think the best is still to come. And I will stop here. Right. So that's a very good question. He must be a physicist. And, so there are many layers to what he is asking. How well do we know how gravity works? Well, we have a theory. We have 2 theories, one immersed in the other one. We have Newtonian dynamics, which is a subset of general relativity. And all we can do is to have that theory, and which tells us the answer to the question, and test it with experiment. And as far as we know, the theory, well, as far as we know, we do know, the theory has passed every test we've been able to do of it so far, the most spectacular of which was the discovery of gravitational waves a couple of years ago from black holes colliding. That was exactly, it's not subtle, I'm sorry, it's not obvious, it's a subtle outcome of the way gravity works in relativity, that gravitational waves are produced. Many other versions of gravity wouldn't produce gravitational waves. And so I would agree philosophically that we don't really know how gravity works, but the way I think we should work in physics is to have a theory, take it at face value, extract its predictions, and test them. And insofar as the tests are satisfied, then you think you have some understanding. Now, of course, the history of science tells us that that is a relative position of security because your whole world can crumble when something unexpected happens. And it may well be that, for example, the dark energy is telling us your theories are all wrong. Relativity doesn't work at that level, at some level. We know it works at some level, just like Newton's theory worked in explaining the motions of planets around the sun, but it doesn't work in explaining phenomena on cosmic scales. Maybe our theory of relativity would have to be superseded by something bigger. Maybe the dark energy will be seen to have been the flag that told us your theories are wrong, and maybe gravity is something different. But as far as we can tell, all the tests we've done of relativity, including, I would add, some of the tests that I talked about here, they all tick. And so I think the presumption is that that is the way gravity works, and that it is produced by a particle. Some people would say, well, but why haven't you found the particle yet? And many of my colleagues are gloomy that in spite of 30 years of looking for it, there's still no evidence that these particles exist. I'm an optimist. I think they're there. We just haven't tried hard enough. But yes, I think that's all the answer I can offer.
Universe will continue to expand for whatever it is, 140 billion years, and go totally cold and dark. Is there anything in the math that will allow for regeneration, for a new singularity to appear and a new universe to develop?
Well, definitely in the equations, that possibility is still open. It's not, so the equations of relativity again, or modifications of it that might account for the dark energy. So in relativity, one can include the effects of dark energy by invoking something called the cosmological constant, which Einstein himself introduced by mistake, called it his biggest blunder, and then is now being reinstated. So relativity can happily live with the cosmological constant, and in that case, if it is really constant, we know exactly what will happen. It's just what you said, that the universe will continue expanding forever, accelerating. It'll be bad news for astronomers because the expansion will become, already is, at the edges much faster than the speed of light. But that will happen closer and closer, so this horizon of the universe will shrink, and we'll see less and less until eventually we won't be able to see outside our own planet. So that's kind of gloomy, but even before that happens, as you said, matter will have decayed, protons will have decayed, and the universe will become a cold, very boring expanse. That is if the answer to dark energy is, but if it's not, then all bets are off. So if it is something more interesting, either some kind of concept that we can accommodate within physics, or something more dramatic, like a modification of relativity, then all bets are off. We just don't know. We simply do not know what the long-term future of the universe is. For all we know, and this is perfectly compatible with the possibilities of these theories, the universe might eventually recollapse or not. So that is an open question. And some of these experiments that I mentioned there might give us some glimpse of what the long-range forecast for our universe is. But at the moment, yes, all bets are off. We might live in a universe that will continue expanding forever or eventually recollapse. Still, it's still possible. Well, so all that astronomers measure is the rate of expansion of the universe. So what these people, Rees and colleagues who got the Nobel Prize, measured was the speed at which galaxies are receding away from each other. That's all the empirical measurement. The rest is then interpretation which requires some theory. So for example, what I was just talking about now, if the dark energy is this Einstein cosmological constant, then we know how to solve the equation, and we can say to the equation, we observe this accelerated expansion, how much cosmological constant do we need? And you can work that number out. It's actually quite simple to work out because you know how much push you need to give to the galaxies. And this is where there is a crisis, because we can measure that quantity to great precision, but we can also use the physics that we know today to predict, if it existed as such, how big should it be given the physics that we know today. And you get a complete mismatch between what astronomers measure and what the theory predicts. And it's not a small difference. It's not 10% or 20%. The theory is wrong by a factor of 10 to the 120. So it's the biggest, the most incorrect prediction ever made in physics. So some people say that tells us it's not a cosmological constant. It must be something different. Other people say, well, maybe, as I was saying before, relativity is not complete. We know it's not complete. We know relativity breaks down. So when I said physicists can keep a straight face from 10 to the minus 35 seconds onwards, the reason for that is that we know relativity and quantum physics break down. Not quite at 10 to the minus 35, at 10 to the minus 43, but that's just nitpicking. We know that those theories don't work together. So Einstein actually spent most of his life trying to unify gravity and quantum physics, relativity and quantum physics, and failed. Stephen Hawking died without solving the problem either. And so we know physics breaks down at some point. And maybe that error is a symptom of that. So that's how we measure it, just by translating the accelerated expansion into an energy density according to some model. So if one has a different model, it's not the cosmological constant, then the number would be different. But it's an interpretation of a simple observation that galaxies are just accelerating away from us.
I wonder how you consider consciousness in the evolution of the cosmos and so on. What would be the role of it? It seems to be something very different from all these physical properties you were talking about.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a very interesting question because, see, cosmologists have many handicaps in their science. I mean, for one thing, unlike biologists have hundreds or thousands of rats or whatever they want to investigate, amoeba or whatever. Chemists, they have lots of compounds. We cosmologists have one universe and only one. So we don't know what's, maybe we live in a neurotic universe. We don't know what's general of universes, what just belongs to our universe. So that's one problem. Second problem is, unlike chemists and biologists and other reputable scientists, we cannot do experiments. We can try to simulate things, but it's not the same. And the third is to do with your question. We're part of the system we're trying to investigate. So it's unique. And that's probably why cosmology on the one hand is so fascinating and on the other hand is so hard, because we are part of the system we're trying to investigate. Now, so in the simulations that I show you, in my career, we've gone from simulations that if I show to my students now, they'll just giggle and laugh at how simplistic and silly they were. I've seen simulations where you have a little few dots moving around to what I show you now, where we can make galaxies. The next step, surely, is to try and see whether we can understand the formation of planets, where there's also an area of astronomy where enormous progress is happening. Once we can make planets, then it's just a matter of trying harder. Unfortunately, now we need to bring in the chemists and understand life. And I don't think we're so far from being able to make life in a computer. I mean, virtual life. Just like you make virtual galaxies. It's just a matter of chemistry and observations that we still don't have. So, but I don't see the possibility of understanding the origin of life that as an impossibility. I think that in principle should be a soluble problem. Now, once you have life, then the question is, where do you stop? And now here, we go from science to speculation. So if you can model life, can you also model the emergence of consciousness? That I don't know. And, but one of my favorite movies is the, what's it called, Mark? What is this movie, this famous movie, where we're all a computer simulation? The Matrix. It's one of my favorite movies because in that movie, somebody a bit more advanced than us has already figured out how to simulate life and consciousness, and they're having a good time having model us. So we're nothing other than a computer simulation by some other slightly mischievous and perverse, more advanced civilization. So, but I warn you, I stop the science at modeling the origin of life. Beyond that, I would just say is speculation, very interesting speculation, but nothing more than that at the moment.
Apologies for the logistical issues
No
at
problem.
the
It's not
beginning.
your fault.
Quite nicely.
That was fun.
Yes, yes.
But my nap worked.
Yeah, exactly.
Very, very, very nice. I hope I didn't go for too long because my clock stopped.
No, that was fine. Yeah. The questions and the... So you were right that it's actually a masterpiece.
Yeah, well, I could tell. I could tell. So I hope you're not too disappointed. But anyway.
No, I'm very satisfied with the answer. Sorry for putting you on the
No,
spot.
no, no. I think that's all the questions, including the consciousness question. I like the question.
That was a very good answer.
Very good one.
The answer to the last question was very good, I think.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I do like the Matrix. but I do think that I think understanding the emergence of life must be given. I mean, when I look at how this subject has advanced, then I don't think understanding the origin of life would be so hard. And as soon as we find evidence for life somewhere else, I think we'll just take off.
Okay.
Yeah?
Thank you for an interesting lecture.
Well, thank you for coming. Yes, and for your question. I like your question.
The evolution of biology and life, and if that is an emerging quality of matter.
Consciousness being? Yes. But well, I don't think we know the answer. That's a profound question. We don't know really what consciousness is. I mean, it's even difficult to define.
We think we have it all the time.
We experience it. And for example, like reading some readings like animals that seem to be self-conscious.
How complicated what it need to be
you can get my whole talk from the web. Yep. Hi. Okay, I can't pronounce your name because that I can say. Very good question. So yes. So this, in fact, is a complicated topic. What happens is that it's two ways. This is mostly to look at, you're not a physicist. No, I'm not a physicist. So it's looking at the light. For example, if you look at the light from stars behind the gas cloud, then say there's a gas cloud and there's a light. Then the light goes through the gas cloud absorbs some of the light, and then by looking at the light, then you can say, oh, well, this light absorbs that, it's kind of serious, even complicated with zinc, so you can carry absorption whatever you have in certain situations that depend on the chemical composition. But it's all to do with the way light is absorbed and it different elements.
Actually, it's all right.
I'm sure it's possible to.
He doesn't know anything.
What would you do? You would have no room, too much sound. What Actually, last time I was here,
Well, it's to do with black holes, usually. It's information paradox. It's information loss. But because the Big Bang is like the inverse of black hole. Black holes absorb really big. Big size. Two different things. So you can think of it as a direct inverse of black hole, and then all this information it's complicated.
Thank you so much.
Yeah?
Then there's a big bang. I wouldn't see a reversion, a big contraction.
It could be.
Everything gets into nothing.
Could be. Yeah, I could be.
Very bad.
Yes.
Maybe I was
Yeah, that's right.
It could be.
We actually have to close the room, right?
That will collapse again. That depends on the dark energy. So if the dark
Is
energy.
that a bit discussed by cosmologists?
For sure. Yes, of course. Yeah. In fact, many of these machines that I showed you are designed to tell us a bit more about dark energy because the answer to that question has to do with what the dark energy is. Because we don't know what it is, we cannot give you an answer to the future of the universe.
Yes, I just showed them how they can find it. Yes.
Which one? This one?
Yeah, this one.
Oh, you put. Oh, okay.
We actually have to start going outside.
Okay. So let me put this away.
Yes, on your computer.
So this one is going to be on YouTube?
This one was streamed on YouTube live. It wasn't saved. But I found another very similar talk you have given before, so that's the one I gave the link to.
Okay. I didn't know they were on YouTube. So I didn't know about it. So how does this work? Because it's a stream.
So this one was a live stream, but you know, if you just Google your name.
All right. Well, this is great. I become a celebrity.
Yeah, you see it.
Oh, wow.
There.
All right. But what does the screen, you can see the screen or you can just see me walking around. If I show that picture to my Pilates teacher, she's going to be so annoyed because I'm bent. Now, do I have everything?
Thank you for a nice talk, Carlos.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I'm impressed how you handled the consciousness question. It's very well done. Very
Thank you. Yes. This is one of the few compensations for the gray hair. You learn how to deal with that.
Yes.
Right. Right.